What if the biggest threat to your home's value isn't the economy, but water? Right now, over 40 million Americans live in areas facing serious water stress. Major reservoirs across the western United States have dropped to historic lows. Some cities are already limiting new construction because there simply isn't enough water to guarantee supply. And here's the part most homeowners aren't thinking about. When water becomes uncertain, buyers become cautious. When buyers become cautious, home prices feel it. In some fast-growing cities, water shortages are quietly slowing development, increasing utility costs, and changing long-term property outlooks. And most people don't even realize it's happening. This isn't about panic, it's about awareness. In today's video, we're breaking down 10 US cities where water shortages may already be hurting home values. And number 1 might shock you, because it's one of America's hottest real estate markets. Boise. Over the past decade, Boise has been one of America's fastest-growing housing markets. Families moved in for affordability, outdoor lifestyle, and lower taxes. But rapid population growth has quietly created a new pressure point: water supply. Boise depends heavily on mountain snowpack and regional aquifers. In years when snow levels drop or drought conditions intensify, the long-term reliability of water becomes a serious concern. Idaho has already seen increased conversations around groundwater management, irrigation limits, and balancing agricultural use with residential expansion. Why does this matter for home prices? Because water access directly impacts development. If new housing permits slow down due to water availability concerns, growth projections shift. And when growth projections shift, investor confidence can weaken. Buyers begin asking different questions. How stable is the supply? Are future restrictions possible? Will water costs rise? Boise hasn't collapsed, far from it. But the risk is subtle. It's about long-term sustainability, not immediate crisis. And markets often react before headlines do. If you're buying in a fast-growing city like Boise, research local groundwater policies and long-term water management plans before making a decision. If this surprised you, stay with us. The next city on our list faces even stronger water stress. And if you value data-driven real estate insights, make sure to like the video and subscribe to State Station for more deep dives into America's changing property markets. Salt Lake City. Salt Lake City has been seen as one of the West's most stable and attractive housing markets. Strong job growth, access to the outdoors, and a relatively balanced cost of living have drawn thousands of new residents. But beneath that growth story lies a growing environmental concern: the shrinking Great Salt Lake. Over the past several years, the lake has reached historically low levels due to prolonged drought, reduced snowpack, and increasing water diversion for agriculture and urban development. Scientists have warned that declining water levels don't just affect wildlife, they can also impact air quality, local climate patterns, and long-term water stability. For homeowners and buyers, this creates an uncomfortable question. What happens to property values if water uncertainty becomes a long-term issue? Water scarcity can influence development approvals, infrastructure costs, and future building regulations. If water restrictions tighten, new housing supply may slow. At the same time, higher utility costs and environmental concerns may cause some buyers to hesitate. Even subtle shifts in buyer sentiment can impact demand over time. Salt Lake City is not in immediate crisis, but long-term water management is becoming central to its future. Investors and homeowners are beginning to pay closer attention to state-level conservation policies and infrastructure investments. When water becomes part of the housing conversation, it changes how people evaluate risk. And in real estate, perception alone can move markets. Las Vegas. Las Vegas may be famous for bright lights and nonstop growth, but its future is tied to something far less glamorous: the Colorado River. Nearly 90% of southern Nevada's water supply comes from this single source, primarily through Lake Mead. And in recent years, Lake Mead has reached historically low levels, triggering federal water shortage declarations. Now here's what makes Las Vegas unique. The city has actually become one of the most efficient water recycling systems in the country. Indoor water is reused, strict landscaping laws limit grass, and conservation programs are aggressive. But efficiency doesn't eliminate dependency. The region is still operating within a shrinking river system shared by multiple states. So how does this affect home prices? Water uncertainty impacts long-term development planning. In certain areas outside the core metro zone, groundwater approvals have slowed or been denied due to sustainability concerns. When building permits face water-related restrictions, it changes growth projections. And in a city heavily dependent on continued expansion, growth expectations matter. There's also the investor factor. Institutional buyers and long-term developers now analyze climate and water data before committing capital. Even if there's no immediate shortage for residents, the perception of long-term risk can cool demand. Las Vegas remains resilient, but its housing future is directly connected to water negotiations, conservation policies, and regional river agreements. In a desert city built on expansion, water isn't just a utility, it's a foundation for property value stability. Phoenix has been one of the fastest-growing cities in America for years. Affordable land, job growth, and sunshine attracted thousands of new residents. But now, water supply concerns are beginning to intersect directly with housing development. Phoenix relies on a combination of Colorado River water, surface reservoirs, and groundwater. With prolonged drought conditions across the Southwest and reduced snowpack in the Rockies, long-term water projections have become less certain. In fact, Arizona officials have already restricted new home construction in certain areas where developers cannot prove a guaranteed 100-year groundwater supply. That kind of policy change sends a signal to the housing market. When development approvals slow, growth expectations adjust. Investors begin factoring in regulatory risk. Builders face higher compliance costs, and buyers start asking long-term questions about sustainability. Even if there's no immediate tap running dry, uncertainty can influence demand, especially among out-of-state buyers unfamiliar with desert water systems. Extreme heat compounds the issue. As temperatures regularly exceed 110 degrees in summer, outdoor water usage increases while evaporation rates accelerate. Infrastructure must work harder, and utility costs can rise over time. Phoenix is not collapsing, but the rules are changing. Water is no longer just an environmental discussion. It's becoming a real estate variable. In a city built on rapid expansion, anything that slows growth can ripple into home price momentum. And when markets are driven by growth expectations, even subtle shifts can quietly affect long-term property values. Tucson doesn't grow as explosively as Phoenix, but that doesn't mean it's immune to water pressure. In fact, Tucson has spent decades carefully managing its groundwater supply because aquifer depletion was once a serious concern. The city now relies on a mix of Colorado River water, reclaimed water, and local groundwater reserves, but long-term stress remains part of the conversation. The challenge is subtle. Tucson sits in a desert climate with limited rainfall and rising temperatures. Prolonged drought cycles reduce surface water availability, while population growth steadily increases demand. Even if current systems are stable, projections for future supply require constant infrastructure investment and conservation efforts. For the housing market, this creates what you might call a slow burn risk. Tucson isn't facing sudden building bans or immediate shortages. Instead, it faces long-term sustainability scrutiny. Developers must meet strict water certification standards before projects move forward. That adds cost and complexity to expansion. And when development becomes more regulated, supply growth can slow. Slower supply growth can stabilize prices, but it can also limit affordability and reduce speculative investor interest. Another factor is buyer psychology. As climate and water issues become more visible nationally, desert cities face heightened scrutiny from relocating families. Even if conditions are manageable, perception matters. Tucson remains more affordable than many Western cities, which gives it resilience. But in a region where every gallon counts, long-term aquifer management and conservation policy will continue influencing housing confidence. In today's market, even quiet environmental constraints can shape future home value trends. Los Angeles may be one of the largest and most economically powerful cities in the country, but its water story is surprisingly fragile. Unlike cities built near major rivers or lakes, Los Angeles imports a significant portion of its water from distant sources, including Northern California and the Colorado River. That means the city's water stability depends not only on local rainfall, but also on statewide drought conditions and interstate agreements. In recent years, California has experienced repeated drought cycles, forcing water restrictions across many communities. Lawn watering limits, conservation mandates, and rising water rates have become part of everyday life. While these policies are designed to preserve supply, they also increase long-term utility costs for homeowners. And here's where real estate comes into play. When infrastructure becomes more expensive to maintain, those costs eventually pass through to residents. Higher water bills, mandatory efficiency upgrades, and ongoing drought management programs can subtly raise the cost of owning property. Over time, that affects affordability calculations. Los Angeles also faces the added challenge of balancing rapid housing demand with resource limitations. If future droughts intensify or imported water becomes more expensive, development costs could rise further. Investors already factor climate resilience into long-term projections, especially in high-priced markets. Los Angeles remains desirable, but its heavy reliance on imported water makes it uniquely exposed to external supply disruptions. In a market where prices are already high, even small increases in long-term ownership costs can influence buyer behavior and future appreciation trends. San Diego. San Diego is often ranked as one of the most desirable places to live. In a full coastline, strong job sectors, and a mild climate have supported steady housing demand for years. But behind that appeal lies a quiet vulnerability: heavy dependence on imported water combined with rising utility costs. Like Los Angeles, San Diego imports a large percentage of its water from distant sources, including the Colorado River and Northern California. When drought conditions intensify across the West, San Diego feels the ripple effects. To secure supply, the region has invested heavily in infrastructure projects like desalination plants and long-distance pipelines. While these projects improve reliability, they also come at a financial cost. And those costs don't disappear. Higher infrastructure investment means higher long-term water rates for homeowners. In a city where property prices are already elevated, rising utility expenses add another layer to total ownership cost. Buyers increasingly evaluate not just mortgage payments, but also ongoing monthly expenses. There's also the perception factor. As climate headlines focus on Western drought and water negotiations, some buyers grow cautious about desert-adjacent coastal markets. Even if supply remains stable today, uncertainty about future pricing and restrictions can influence long-term investment decisions. San Diego remains resilient due to strong demand and limited housing supply. However, when affordability tightens and environmental risk enters the conversation, appreciation trends can slow. In competitive housing markets, even small increases in cost sensitivity can subtly shape pricing momentum over time. Denver. Denver has long marketed itself as the gateway to the Rockies, a city powered by outdoor lifestyle, growth, and steady migration from higher-cost states. But much of Denver's water supply depends on one critical factor: mountain snowpack. When winter snowfall declines, the entire system feels it. Colorado's snowpack acts like a natural reservoir. As it melts gradually in spring and summer, it feeds rivers and storage systems that supply cities like Denver. In recent years, however, warming temperatures and inconsistent snowfall patterns have created variability in that supply. Some seasons remain strong, others fall short of expectations. And when snowpack declines, water managers must tighten conservation efforts. The tension becomes more noticeable when population growth continues. Denver's metro area has expanded significantly over the past decade. More residents mean more housing, more landscaping, more commercial demand, and more pressure on limited water resources. Even if the system remains functional, long-term projections become more complicated. From a real estate perspective, growth expectations are everything. When investors and developers believe a city will expand smoothly, capital flows easily. But when environmental constraints begin influencing infrastructure planning, that optimism can cool slightly. Builders may face additional compliance requirements. Municipalities may restrict certain types of development in outer suburban areas where water access is harder to guarantee. There's also the issue of cost. Infrastructure upgrades, reservoir expansions, and conservation programs require funding. Over time, these costs can influence water rates and municipal fees. In a market where affordability has already tightened due to rising home prices, additional expenses matter. Denver is far from crisis mode. The city has strong management systems and diversified supply strategies. But the balance between growth and water sustainability is becoming more central to its long-term housing outlook. In a region where every winter's snowpack now carries financial implications, water is no longer just seasonal, it's structural to the housing market's future. Albuquerque. Albuquerque may not grab headlines like larger western cities, but its water story is just as important. The city relies heavily on the Rio Grande and underground aquifers for its supply. Over the years, extended drought conditions and reduced river flows have raised concerns about how reliable that system will be long-term. Unlike fast-growing boomtowns, Albuquerque's housing market has been more measured. But slower growth doesn't eliminate risk, it simply changes how it shows up. When river levels fluctuate or drought cycles intensify, water management becomes a central issue for city planners. Infrastructure improvements and conservation programs have helped stabilize supply, but the margin for error remains thin in dry years. For homeowners and investors, the concern isn't necessarily immediate shortage, it's sustainability. If water supply projections tighten, development expansion could slow. That means fewer large-scale housing projects and more scrutiny on permits in certain areas. Over time, limited expansion can influence housing inventory and pricing momentum. There's also the affordability factor. Albuquerque is often seen as a relatively affordable alternative to cities like Denver or Phoenix. But if infrastructure costs rise to secure long-term water reliability, those costs can filter into utility bills or municipal fees. Buyer perception plays a role as well. As national attention grows around Western drought, even cities with strong conservation efforts can face questions about long-term stability. And when buyers start asking environmental questions, it subtly reshapes demand patterns. Albuquerque's future will depend heavily on river health, aquifer recovery, and careful water planning, all of which are becoming increasingly important to its housing outlook. Austin. Austin has been one of America's hottest housing markets for years. Tech expansion, job growth, and an influx of new residents pushed home prices sharply upward. But behind that growth story is a more fragile variable: water stability. Austin depends heavily on the Highland Lake system, which is fed by the Colorado River of Texas. During strong rainfall years, reservoirs remain healthy. But during prolonged drought cycles, lake levels can drop dramatically. Texas has a long history of severe drought periods, and recent years have shown how quickly reservoir levels can fluctuate. Now combine that with explosive population growth. As thousands of new residents move into the Austin metro area, water demand increases. More homes, more landscaping, more commercial activity, all pulling from the same supply system. When drought warnings intensify, the city often enacts staged water restrictions. While these measures help conserve supply, they also highlight how dependent growth is on stable rainfall patterns. From a real estate perspective, rapid growth depends on confidence. Investors and developers closely monitor infrastructure capacity. If water volatility becomes more frequent, it can affect long-term development planning, especially in outer suburban zones where infrastructure expansion is more expensive. There's also a financial layer. Expanding treatment plants, reservoirs, and pipeline systems requires major capital investment. Over time, those costs can translate into higher utility rates and municipal fees, adding to overall housing expenses. Austin remains dynamic and economically strong, but when a high-growth city sits in a drought-prone climate, water stops being background noise. It becomes a central factor in how sustainable long-term home price momentum truly is. Water is no longer just an environmental issue, it's becoming a real estate factor. In fast-growing cities, long-term water security can influence development, utility costs, and even buyer confidence. The markets we discussed today aren't collapsing, but they are evolving, and smart homeowners pay attention before headlines hit. So now I want to ask you, would water shortages change where you buy a home? Is your city investing enough in long-term supply? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you value data-driven housing insights like this, make sure to like the video and subscribe to State Station for more deep dives into America's changing real estate trends.